If you showed this photo to anyone in 1975 and told them that in 4 years this woman would be facing 70 lashes for showing her hair, they'd think you were insane. They'd laugh at you. They'd order another round of French champagne and get back to the jazz set. Iran wasn't just westernized, it was the future. It was a nuclear-powered, oil-drenched, hyper-modern empire that was on track to outpace Japan. But while the Shah was busy ordering 50,000 songbirds for a party in the desert, his secret police were perfecting medieval techniques in a basement nearby. This is the story of the civilization that was deleted in a weekend. Before we dive into the wreckage of this lost world, I need to know, which corner of the world are you watching this from? Drop your flag or city in the comments. I'm curious how far this story has traveled, especially for those of you whose parents lived through this. In the 1970s, Iran was the main character of the Middle East. While its neighbors were still figuring out basic irrigation, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was playing a real-life game of Sim City on God mode. He called it the White Revolution. He didn't just want to modernize, he wanted to teleport Iran into the year 2000. He built a world-class airline, Iran Air, which was the first to order the Concorde. He started a nuclear energy program. He turned Tehran into the Paris of the East, where the streets were lined with French boutiques and the university looked like a Silicon Valley campus. But while the world looked at the miniskirts and the disco lights, they missed the growing shadow underneath the pavement. Because behind all that forced freedom was a secret police force so terrifying they made the Stasi look like a neighborhood watch, and they were being funded by the West. Stick with me, because in the final 2 minutes of this video, I'm going to reveal the contents of a secret CIA psychological profile on the Shah from 1978. It shows that the Americans knew the revolution was coming, not because of religion, but because of a specific, bizarre personality flaw in the Shah that made his downfall inevitable. If you scroll through Instagram in 2026, you've probably seen the before the revolution reels. Women with beehive hair, vintage Mustangs, and beaches in the Caspian Sea that looked like Saint Tropez. This wasn't a facade. This was the new Iran. In the 70s, Tehran was the cultural capital of Asia. You could watch a Broadway play on Tuesday, go to a casino on Wednesday, and attend a state dinner with Elizabeth Taylor on Thursday. The Shah's father had actually banned the hijab decades earlier. He didn't just discourage it, police would literally rip the veils off women in the street. It was progress by force. For the urban elite, it was a dream. For the conservative millions living outside the city, it was a declaration of war on their soul. But the cultural divide was nothing compared to the rage bait event of the century, the party that would eventually cost the Shah his throne. 1971, the 2,500-year celebration of the Persian Empire at Persepolis. The Shah decided to throw a party that would make the Great Gatsby look like a budget wedding. He built a literal tent city in the middle of the desert, except the tents were made of French silk and had air conditioning. He flew in 50,000 songbirds from Europe to create a lush garden in the sand. Every single one of them died in the 100-degree heat within 48 hours. He served 5,000 bottles of 1911 champagne and peacocks stuffed with foie gras. The total bill? Adjusted for 2026 inflation, it was roughly $516 million. World leaders, kings, and queens ate from gold plates, while just a few miles away, local villages didn't even have running water. It was the ultimate let them eat cake moment. The Shah thought he was showing the world a superpower. Instead, he was handing his enemies a recruitment poster that would burn his palace to the ground. You can't talk about 1970s Iran without talking about Savak. If you were a student who read the wrong book or an intellectual who questioned the Shah's spending, you'd get a visit from the National Intelligence and Security Organization. Trained by the CIA and Mossad, SAVAK became a nightmare. They didn't just arrest people, they erased them. They used medieval torture methods, boiling water, fingernail extraction, and sensory deprivation. The irony was peak 20th century cognitive dissonance. You could go to a disco and dance to ABBA, but you couldn't mention the Shah's name in a whisper without looking over your shoulder. By 1977, the rising tiger was beginning to limp. Inflation was sky high, the secret police were overworked, and a bearded old man in exile was about to send a series of cassette tapes that would change everything. While the Shah was buying the latest fighter jets, his nemesis, Ayatollah Khomeini, was using a technology that seemed about as threatening as a toaster, the audio cassette tape. Living in exile in a small village in France, Khomeini would record his sermons, fiery populist speeches attacking the Shah's Westoxification, and his followers would smuggle them back into Iran. From there, it was a viral loop before the internet existed. Some 90,000 mosques across the country became duplication hubs. People would huddle in basements, listening to the hissing, lo-fi voice of a man promising a return to dignity. It was the world's first podcast revolution. The Shah's sophisticated radar and SAVAK spies were looking for bombs and guns. They weren't looking for 60-minute Maxell tapes. By the time they realized the tapes were stronger than fighter planes, the hissing of the cassette had become the heartbeat of the street. But the religious crowds weren't the only ones marching. There was a second, much weirder army forming, and they were using the Shah's own schools against him.
Remember that Silicon Valley vibe I mentioned? The Shah had sent over 50,000 Iranian students to study in the US and Europe, hoping they'd bring back engineering degrees. Instead, they brought back the spirit of 1968. These students became the intellectual muscle of the revolution. They formed a bizarre coalition: Marxists who wanted a workers' paradise, secular liberals who wanted a Western-style democracy, and Islamic socialists who wanted a bit of both. They all hated the Shah's arrogance more than they feared each other. They'd wear masks during protests to avoid being identified by SAVAK agents lurking in the crowds. This wasn't a disorganized mob. This was an international network of the brightest minds Iran had ever produced, all working to delete the man who paid for their tuition. But as the protests moved from D.C. to the streets of Tehran, a single tragedy in a movie theater would turn unrest into an all-out civil war. August 1978, Abadan. A crowded movie theater called Cinema Rex is showing a film that, in a twist of dark irony, was critical of the regime. Suddenly, the doors are locked from the outside. The building is doused in gasoline. 480 people are burned alive. The revolution didn't just walk after that, it ran. The protesters blamed SAVAK. The government blamed religious fanatics. It didn't matter who actually did it, the social contract was incinerated. The middle class, who had tolerated the Shah for the sake of their Porsches and nightclubs, finally had enough. They joined the workers. They joined the Bazaris. The Paris of the East became a city of barricades. And that's when the main character of the story, the Shah himself, made a choice that sealed the fate of the 2,500-year-old monarchy forever.
If you're enjoying this deep dive into what Iran looked like before the revolution in 1979, hit subscribe. It's free, it costs you nothing, and it keeps me from having to get a real job reviewing AI cat videos. Now, back to the story. By late 1978, the Shah was a ghost of himself. He was secretly dying of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a fact he hid even from the Americans. He was caught in a vacillation loop.
One day he'd order the army to fire on crowds like the infamous Black Friday massacre, and the next he'd go on national television looking pale and defeated, saying, "I have heard the message of your revolution." In the high-stakes game of 20th century autocracy, maybe is a death sentence. The military didn't know whether to shoot or salute. The U.S. State Department was divided. Jimmy Carter, trying to inject human rights into foreign policy, was pressuring the Shah to play nice, while the CIA was telling him to get cuff. It was a geopolitical blue screen of death. With the Shah paralyzed by indecision, the revolution's most unlikely allies, the communists and the clerics, were about to have a meeting of the minds that would lead to a total blackout of the old world. It's one of the greatest what-ifs in history. Why did the two-day Communist Party and the secular liberals back a 78-year-old Ayatollah? They thought they were being clever. They saw Khomeini as a useful idiot, a spiritual mascot they could use to mobilize the uneducated masses, only to shove him aside once the Shah was gone. They called him the Gandhi of Iran. They genuinely believed a man who spent 15 years writing about theocracy would suddenly want to retire to a library in Qom once the fighting stopped. It's the ultimate 1970s main character syndrome. Everyone thought they were the protagonist, and they all underestimated the man with the cassette tapes. On January 16, 1979, the rising tiger finally stopped breathing. The Shah packed a small box of Iranian soil, boarded his private jet, and left for a vacation. He never saw his palace again. 2 weeks later, February 1st, 1979, a chartered Air France Boeing 747 enters Iranian airspace. Inside is Ruhollah Khomeini. Outside, on the streets of Tehran, are 6 million people. It was the largest human gathering in history to that point. The air was thick with the smell of rose water and burning tires. The Atlantis of the East didn't sink. It was overtaken by a tidal wave. In just 10 days, the 10 days of dawn, the military declared neutrality, the prime minister fled, and the 2,500-year-old Persian monarchy simply ceased to exist. But as the victory party started, the secular students and the Marxists noticed something chilling. The podcast king wasn't interested in sharing power.
Within months, the Paris of the East was being systematically reformatted. He was like a factory reset on an entire culture. The nightclubs smashed. The jazz records melted. The women who had marched in jeans for freedom were suddenly told that freedom now meant the mandatory hijab. This was the Great Deletion. The coalition that broke the Shah was immediately devoured by its own leader. The Marxists were arrested, the liberals were pushed out, the SAVAK was replaced by the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, who used the same prisons but with new slogans on the walls. The Atlantis wasn't lost to the sea, it was painted over. And here's the twist. The new regime didn't just throw away the Shah's superpower tools. They picked them up, dusted them off, and turned them into the shadow war machine we know today. This is the part people miss. The Islamic Republic didn't revert to the 7th century. They became a high-tech theocracy. They kept the Shah's F-14 Tomcats, the only ones ever exported. They kept his nuclear research facilities. They kept his centralized state power. They took the rising tiger and gave it a different soul. The infrastructure of the Silicon Valley of the 70s became the spine of the drone superpower of the 2020s. When you see an Iranian satellite launch or a cyber attack today, you're seeing the ghost of the Shah's modernization, repurposed for a 50-year-long grudge match with the West. Now, I promised you the CIA's secret psychological profile from 1978. For decades, it was classified as top secret/sensitive, hidden in the archives of Langley, while the world wondered how a superpower in waiting could implode in a single weekend. The analysts didn't just call him a dictator, they diagnosed him with what they termed messianic narcissism. The Shah didn't think he was just a king, he believed he was a divinely appointed vessel for the 2,500-year-old soul of Cyrus the Great. This explains why he could ignore his own starving citizens while ordering $516 million worth of stuffed peacock and French silk. He genuinely believed his great civilization was so inevitable that the people suffering was just a temporary glitch in his divine spreadsheet. But here is the piece that still haunts D.C. today. The CIA explicitly warned the White House that the Shah's ego was pathologically fragile. They predicted that if he was forced to choose between being a liberal reformer and a strongman, his mind would simply fracture.
When the U.S. pressured him to stop the Syvax torture sessions in 1977, the Shah didn't become a better leader. He became a paralyzed one. He stopped making decisions. He stopped leading the army. The rising tiger didn't just lose a war, it lost its brain. The West spent decades building a fortress Iran around a man they knew was mentally incapable of holding the keys. And that's why in 2026, we look at these old photos of women in miniskirts with such a weird sense of grief. Because it wasn't just a fashion trend that died, it was a version of the future that we were told was guaranteed. Iran before 1979 wasn't a perfect paradise, and it wasn't a medieval wasteland. It was a high-speed experiment in progress by force that crashed into a brick wall of tradition, inequality, and one man's massive ego. It's a cautionary tale for the 21st century. You can build the tallest skyscrapers, the fastest airlines, and the most advanced nuclear reactors, but if you leave the soul of the people behind, you're not building a country, you're just building a very expensive museum of what could have been. If you want to know how a hospital visit turned Iran into the United States' biggest enemy, click the video on the left. Otherwise, drop a comment. If you were in Tehran in 1975, would you have seen the end coming? I'll see you in the comments. Stay curious.